For 50 years, Miguel Santos rose before the sun, his footsteps tracing the same worn path down to the harbor of Porto All. With hands weathered by salt and time, he would untie the rope of his boat, the Esperanza, named for hope, and set off into the golden morning light. That boat wasn't just a vessel. It was part of his soul. It had been his father's before him, and every plank, every scratch, every repaired net told a story of family, tradition, and quiet perseverance. But one evening changed everything. Miguel had just returned from a long day on the water. The fish had been scarce lately, but he'd managed to catch enough to get by. As he approached the dock, a deep rumble cut through the quiet bay. A luxury yacht, blinding white and monstrous in size, came slicing through the calm waters. It was moving far too fast. Miguel waved his arms, shouted, his voice hoarse from years of wind and waves, but the yacht didn't slow. Within seconds, the massive hull collided with his boat, which splintered like paper. Miguel was thrown into the cold sea. When he surfaced, gasping, clinging to a floating piece of timber, he looked up to see the yacht already pulling away. On board stood a man in sunglasses and designer clothes, who barely glanced at the wreckage before shouting down, "Watch where you park that thing." Then he was gone. The Esperanza, his livelihood, his legacy, was gone, crushed. And with it, Miguel felt something inside him break too. That night, the small village gathered. The Coast Guard had come, taken a report, but without witnesses, there was little they could do. The yacht's owner, Victor Delgado, was no stranger to Porto All. He had bought a massive property on the cliffs the year before and built a mansion that cast a literal shadow over the town. The villagers had seen him speeding through the bay before, acting like he owned the sea as much as he did the land. Miguel sat in silence at the council meeting as neighbors debated what to do. They loved him. Everyone did. He was the quiet helper, the man who taught their sons to tie knots, who brought extra fish to the market when someone was struggling. But the truth was, they were all poor. A collection was passed around, and by the end of the night, there was enough money for some wood, maybe a few tools. But not for a motor, not for a real boat. Back home, Miguel broke the news to his wife, Maria. She'd been waiting with a chipped coffee mug and a hopeful smile. That smile vanished when she saw his face. And when he told her the Coast Guard couldn't do anything, that Delgado denied it all, she reached out and held his hand in silence. There were no easy words, only the heaviness of loss. As Miguel lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, his heart ached, not just from grief, but from something more literal. He had a heart condition, and his medication was expensive. Without fishing, there would be no money. Without money, there would be no medicine. And without medicine, well, Miguel didn't let himself finish the thought. He closed his eyes, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. He had lost everything, or so he thought. What Miguel didn't know was that out in the bay, far from the village's dim lights, a research vessel had been drifting quietly that same afternoon. On board were scientists studying coastal erosion. They had no idea their equipment had captured a moment of injustice, one that would soon ripple through the village like a rising tide. And by morning, the harbor Miguel had known his entire life would no longer be the same. Miguel Santos had always believed that the sea gave more than it took, until the day it took everything. For 5 decades, the Esperanza had been more than a fishing boat to him. It had been a second home, a trusted companion, and a link to the past. His father had built it by hand, carving their family name into the bow with steady pride. Miguel had learned to fish on that deck, taught his own son how to tie knots, and even brought home the catch that paid for his wife Maria's sewing machine, the one she still used every morning by the kitchen window. The boat carried his life, his legacy, and every memory that mattered. But one afternoon, as the sun began to dip low and streak the bay with gold, that legacy was shattered. Miguel had just finished loading a modest haul of fish onto the dock when he heard the low, throaty roar of a powerful engine. He turned, squinting against the glare, and saw it sleek, blinding white, and moving far too fast for the narrow bay. A luxury yacht, cutting across the water like it owned the place. And in a way it did. Victor Delgado. Everyone in the village knew his name. The millionaire who'd bought the old monastery land on the cliffs and turned it into a mansion. The man who threw noisy parties that echoed down to the village. The one who never spoke to locals unless giving an order, or worse, a warning. Miguel raised his hands, shouted, waved with urgency. "Slow down," he yelled. But the yacht kept coming, tearing across the calm water like a blade. The collision was instant, violent. The Esperanza didn't stand a chance. Miguel was thrown backward, his body hitting the water hard. He surfaced in time to see his boat crumpling beneath the yacht's steel hull, breaking apart like driftwood. Bits of netting floated. Wood bobbed. His life scattered across the waves. And on the deck above, Delgado didn't even flinch. He looked down with cold detachment and shouted, "Watch where you park that thing," before steering away, leaving behind a churning wake and a man gasping for breath amid the remains of everything he had built. Miguel clawed his way back to shore, soaked and shaking. Not just from the cold, but from shock, from disbelief. He stood there, staring at the floating debris, at the empty space where his boat had always been. His heart pounded, not just with emotion, but with the physical strain of the moment. It had been acting up lately, and the medication he needed, he had just run out last week. He hadn't renewed his insurance. The rates had doubled, and he'd been saving to pay the new premium next month. Too late now. The harbor master, Luis, met him on the dock, horrified. "I saw the aftermath," he said. "We called the Coast Guard. They're sending someone to file a report." But Miguel already knew how it would go. When the officers arrived later that evening, they took down everything, listened politely, promised to investigate. But when it came down to it, there were no witnesses, no direct proof. Just Miguel's word against Delgado's. And the word of a rich man always echoed louder than that of a poor fisherman. Miguel didn't argue. He just nodded, his hands trembling, and walked home in silence. The walk up the coastal path had never felt so long. His knees ached. His chest was tight. His mind was a whirl of questions with no answers. How would he work now? How would he buy medicine? What did a fisherman become when the sea was taken from him? Maria waited at the table, her face lined with quiet worry. One look at Miguel, and she knew. He didn't have to say it, but he did. "It's gone," he whispered. She poured him coffee in his chipped mug, the one with the faded blue fish. "We'll manage," she said softly. "We always do." But Miguel didn't believe that this time, because deep down he felt like something had changed, not just outside, but inside him. A line had been crossed, and for the first time in his long, sea-weathered life, Miguel felt the full weight of powerlessness. And still, he had no idea that the tide had already begun to turn. That evening, as the village's sky dimmed into deep shades of indigo, the community center filled with murmurs, the low rustling of worry and concern. Word of what had happened to Miguel spread quickly. In a town as small and close-knit as Porto Wall, news traveled faster than the tide, especially when it involved someone like Miguel, someone who had quietly served the village for decades, never asking for anything in return. Miguel sat near the back, his weathered hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the wooden floor. He hadn't said much since returning home. Maria had gently urged him to attend the emergency council meeting, even though he had wanted to stay in the silence of their home. But now, surrounded by friends and neighbors, he felt exposed, like a man stripped bare in front of those who had always known him as strong, steady, reliable. Mayor Torres stood at the front of the room, hands clasped behind his back, trying to project calm. "We've contacted Mr. Delgado through official channels," he said. His attorney responded this afternoon. The room collectively leaned forward. His statement says there's no evidence to prove his yacht was responsible. A sharp voice cut through the air. "We all know it was him." It was Pedro, another fisherman, his sun-browned face twisted in frustration. He speeds through the bay like it's his personal playground. The mayor sighed. Technically, part of it is his. The northern stretch of the bay falls within the water rights attached to his cliffside property. Miguel rose slowly to his feet. He didn't speak often at these meetings, but when he did, people listened. "My father fished those waters before I was born. I've worked them for 50 years. That boat, that was all I had. And now," his voice caught, "now I have nothing." The room went quiet. Even the youngest children, playing with sticks by the doorway, stopped, and looked up. Anna, the elderly woman who ran the local market, stood and addressed the room. "We may not have much, but we can help," she said firmly. "Everyone gives what they can. We'll take a collection." Heads nodded in agreement, and the atmosphere shifted, warmth and solidarity rising like steam in the chilly room. A small wooden box was passed around, filled slowly with folded bills and coins. Some of them crumpled, others pulled reluctantly from thin wallets. These were not wealthy people. Every coin meant something, and yet they gave because that's what villages like Porto all did. They looked after their own. By the end of the night, the collection totaled just enough for some basic supplies. Wood rope, maybe enough to begin framing a small vessel. But no motor, no equipment, not even close to what Miguel had lost. Outside, the air had cooled. Stars blanketed the sky above the ocean, and the scent of salt and driftwood lingered in the breeze. Miguel walked home with Maria in silence, the envelope of collected funds tucked under his arm like something fragile and undeserved. Back at their modest home, Maria set the kettle on the stove and busied herself with small tasks, straightening a picture frame, wiping crumbs from the table. Anything to keep her hands from trembling. "They care about you," she said softly, trying to smile. They did what they could. Miguel nodded, lowering himself into his chair, but he said nothing. The truth hung heavy between them. Goodwill was not enough to rebuild a boat. Kindness didn't buy fuel or nets. Hope didn't pay for medicine. Later that night, when Maria had fallen asleep beside him, Miguel lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling. The house creaked in the wind, a sound he usually found comforting. But tonight it echoed like emptiness. He placed a hand on his chest, where the dull ache had begun to return. He had been ignoring it, pretending it wasn't getting worse. But now, with no income and no boat, there was no hiding from the truth. He was 68 years old. He had no savings, no fallback, no strength to start over. And for the first time in his life, Miguel wondered, genuinely, painfully, how many tomorrows he had left. He closed his eyes, not out of peace, but because there was nothing else he could do. And yet, outside that small home, beyond the hills and the quiet streets of Porto all, the sea still moved. Quiet, watching, waiting, holding in its depths something that would change everything. The morning air was still cool when a knock came at Miguel's door. It was Tomas, a lanky, good-natured young man who often helped the older fishermen carry heavy nets or repair equipment. He stood at the threshold, a little out of breath, his cheeks flushed with the brisk dawn wind. "Mr. Miguel," he said quickly, "you need to come to the harbor. There's someone there asking for you. Says it's important." Miguel blinked, still groggy from a restless night. "Someone? Who?" "No idea." Tomas shrugged. "He's wearing a Navy uniform. Coast Guard, maybe." That got Miguel's attention. He dressed quickly, his movements stiff from age and fatigue, and followed Tomas down the narrow path toward the water. The village was still quiet, bathed in the soft pinks and oranges of early morning light. The scent of seaweed and salt filled the air. It was a walk Miguel had taken thousands of times, but today it felt unfamiliar, like something new was waiting just beyond the bend. And then he saw them. 3 vessels were docked at the pier, none of them local. There was a sleek Coast Guard cutter, a long white research vessel bearing the seal of the Oceanic Institute, and a modest but elegant private boat. Miguel's pace slowed. People were gathered at the docks, talking in small clusters. Louise, the harbor master, was there, speaking to a man in uniform. As they approached, the man turned and walked toward Miguel with quiet authority. "Mr. Santos," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Commander Rivera with the Maritime Authority. We need to speak with you regarding the incident with your boat." Miguel nodded slowly, unsure what to say. "I already filed a report. They said there wasn't much that could be done." Commander Rivera gave a small smile, the kind that held back something bigger. "New information has come to light." He gestured toward the research vessel. "That ship belongs to the Oceanic Institute. 2 days ago, they were conducting a coastal erosion study and had surveillance equipment running. Their instruments captured what happened to your boat in full detail." A woman stepped forward from the group, mid-40s, focused eyes, salt-kissed hair, pulled back in a ponytail. "I'm Dr. Vega," she said. Our equipment recorded everything. The yacht's speed, the exact moment of the collision, and, perhaps most importantly, Mr. Delgado's failure to stop or offer aid. Miguel's mouth parted slightly. You saw it? All of it. We did, she confirmed. It's all time-stamped and geotagged. Undeniable. He stood in stunned silence. After days of helplessness, the weight of that word, undeniable, felt like oxygen. Then another voice, familiar in tone but unexpected, joined in. That's because I made sure someone would do something about it. Miguel turned to see an older man walking forward, dressed casually, but with a quiet dignity and aura of someone used to being listened to. I'm Rafael Moreno, the man said. I'm a retired judge, and I was on Dr. Vega's vessel the day your boat was destroyed. Miguel squinted, searching the man's face. You look familiar. You helped me, Rafael said with a nod. 3 months ago, Coastal Road. My car had a flat tire in the rain. Everyone else drove past. But you stopped, changed my tire in the storm, even shared your lunch with me. Miguel remembered. A blue sedan, the man soaked to the bone. The simple exchange of kindness on a lonely stretch of road. It was nothing, Miguel said softly. Just what anyone would do. Rafael shook his head. Not anyone. Most people don't even stop. He glanced toward the water, where pieces of the Esperanza still floated near the shoreline like ghosts of a life once lived. When I saw what happened to your boat in the footage, I recognized you immediately. I made some calls. Behind him, the presence of the research team, the Coast Guard, and legal representatives now made sense. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was the result of one small act of decency, a moment Miguel had long forgotten, but Rafael never had. Miguel looked at them all, still trying to understand. You all came for me? Dr. Vega smiled. Yes, and this is just the beginning. Commander Rivera stepped beside her again. We've issued citations against Mr. Delgado for reckless operation of a vessel, failure to render aid, and environmental damage due to the oil spill from your boat. Miguel's heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with the fragile stirrings of hope, the kind that rises slowly like the tide. He thought of Maria, still asleep back at home, of the chipped mug, the empty space at the dock, and the weight that had settled over his chest just hours ago, whispering that it was too late. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. As Miguel stood on the harbor, surrounded by people he hadn't known existed just a day before, he noticed a new figure step forward. A woman in her 40s, dressed in professional but practical clothing, a leather briefcase tucked under one arm. There was something sharp but kind in her eyes, the sort of look that had seen too many injustices but refused to be hardened by them. Mr. Santos, she said, offering her hand with confidence. I'm Elena Suarez. I'm with the Coastal Fishermen's Legal Aid Society. We're a nonprofit that supports small-scale fishermen in cases just like yours. Miguel hesitated before shaking her hand. But I can't pay for a lawyer. That's not a concern, Elena said gently. Our organization is grant-funded. We exist specifically for situations like this, when powerful people cause harm and think they can walk away because the victim doesn't have the means to fight back. Miguel looked at her, still trying to process this shift in momentum. Just yesterday, he was a man with no boat, no income, and no hope. Now he had a legal advocate standing beside him, offering not just help, but power. Commander Rivera stepped back into the conversation. As of this morning, Mr. Delgado's yacht has been impounded. It won't leave the harbor until this matter is fully investigated and resolved. Miguel blinked. It's been frozen? Officially, Elena confirmed. That gives us leverage. You won't want this to drag out in the courts or the media, especially with the evidence we now have. She opened her briefcase, revealing neatly organized folders. What we'll do next is file a claim for damages. That includes compensation for your destroyed property, lost income, and potential penalties for Delgado's negligence. I'll represent you in all negotiations and legal proceedings. Miguel nodded slowly, overwhelmed. This all feels too much. I'm not used to this kind of help. Elena gave him a small smile. Justice can feel strange when you've gone your whole life without it. As they spoke, Dr. Vega approached once more, a calm breeze catching the ends of her jacket. She waited until Elena had finished, then addressed Miguel with a gentler tone. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," she said. "Our research vessel is stationed here for the next few months. We're studying local ecosystems, erosion patterns, and marine life migrations. But what we don't have, what no textbook or dataset can give us, is local knowledge." Miguel furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone who knows these waters like they know the lines on their own hands. Someone who's lived with the rhythms of the tide for decades. We'd like to hire you, Miguel, part-time, 3 months to start, as a local guide." He stared at her, startled. "It's paid," she added. "Fairly, and it doesn't involve heavy lifting. Just your mind, your experience, your stories." Miguel didn't answer right away. He looked past the harbor, out to the bay where the Esperanza had once floated. The waves were soft today, almost gentle, lapping at the shoreline like a whisper. Just yesterday, that water had mocked him, a reminder of everything he'd lost. But now it looked different, like maybe it was offering something. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why are you all doing this?" Rafael Moreno, who had remained quietly nearby, stepped forward and answered in a voice full of gravity. "Because when the world is broken, sometimes all it takes is one good man to remind us what's worth fixing." Miguel's throat tightened, and for the first time in days, he felt the sting of tears, not from grief, but from gratitude. He had no idea what the coming days would bring, how long the legal battle might last, or what Delgado's lawyers might try next. But for the first time since his boat was destroyed, he didn't feel alone. And that, in itself, was a kind of rescue. By midday, the harbor had transformed from a quiet fishing dock into something that felt more like a courtroom. The Coast Guard vessel remained anchored offshore. The research team worked quietly in the background, and Miguel sat at a weathered wooden table inside the harbor office, now covered in legal documents, folders, and maps. Beside him, Elena Suarez reviewed her notes with the calm precision of someone who had done this many times before. Maria sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting anxiously to the door every time a car passed outside. She hadn't said much since arriving, but her presence was like a steady anchor, grounding Miguel in a moment that felt far too big for someone who'd spent most of his life simply fishing. At exactly noon, a sleek black car pulled up to the dock. From it stepped a man in an immaculate gray suit, briefcase in hand, sunglasses shielding his expression. He moved with the confidence of someone used to negotiating settlements in polished boardrooms, not in small-town harbor offices. "I'm Thomas Wilson," he said flatly, "legal counsel for Mr. Delgado." He barely glanced at Miguel as he took his seat across from Elena, setting his briefcase down with a practiced click. "I understand we're here to resolve an unfortunate misunderstanding." Elena didn't flinch. "We're here to resolve a matter of negligence, destruction of property, in violation of maritime law." Wilson smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "My client is prepared to offer compensation equal to the market value of the damaged vessel." He paused, opening a folder, which we calculate to be approximately 7,000 euros. Miguel's heart sank. 7,000 wouldn't even cover the hull of a new boat, let alone the motor, the gear, the permits, the downtime. It was a number that said, "Take this and disappear." But Elena didn't even blink. She pulled out a folder of her own and slid it across the table. "This is a full breakdown of damages. The actual appraised value of the Esperanza before the incident. Miguel's average annual fishing income based on tax records. The cost of expedited boat construction. And environmental penalties associated with the fuel spill caused by Mr. Delgado's reckless operation." Wilson looked through the documents with faint irritation, his jaw tightening. "We also have the satellite footage," Elena added calmly, "plus multiple witness statements, including testimony from a retired judge. If this proceeds to court, we're fully prepared." The room grew tense. Miguel glanced at Maria, who reached under the table to take his hand. 3 hours passed. The back and forth grew heated at times, but Elena never wavered. She countered every offer with facts, every dismissal with evidence. And slowly, the tone in Wilson's voice shifted, from confident to cautious to resigned. By early afternoon, the settlement was reached. Delgado would cover the full cost of a new fishing vessel, larger and better equipped than the Esperanza, custom-built with modern technology and ready within 2 months. He would also pay Miguel for the income he had lost during that time, and an additional penalty for the environmental damage caused by the spilled fuel. But that wasn't all. As part of the agreement, Delgado, through his legal representation, would accept new maritime regulations in Porto Bay. Speed limits would be enforced, and traditional fishing grounds would be marked and respected. No more roaring yachts tearing through sacred waters. No more entitlement slicing through the lives of people who depended on the sea to survive. When the final signatures were added and Wilson left without another word, the harbor fell quiet. Miguel remained seated, staring at the stack of papers before him as though they might vanish if he blinked. "It's done," Elena said softly. "You stood your ground, Miguel, and you won." He looked up, not with triumph, but with something gentler, something steadier. "I didn't want to win," he said. "I just wanted what was fair." Maria squeezed his hand, her eyes wet. "And now you'll get it." Outside, the sea shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, calm and endless. And for the first time in a long time, Miguel felt like the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to sail toward. 6 months had passed, and the harbor of Porto all looked different now, subtly but meaningfully. A new sign stood at the entrance of the bay, polished and freshly painted. It outlined the speed limits for all vessels and designated the traditional fishing zones that locals had honored for generations, now finally recognized by law. It wasn't just a sign, it was a declaration. This place mattered. These people mattered. And so did Miguel Santos. That morning, the sun spilled gold over the water as Miguel stood on the deck of his new boat, the Nueva Esperanza. The name was carved into the bow, just like the old one. But this vessel was larger, stronger, built with care and modern craftsmanship. Solar panels lined the roof of the cabin. State-of-the-art navigation tools sat beside well-worn tackle boxes. It was both a symbol of progress and a tribute to the past. Beside him stood his grandson, a boy of 11 with eyes full of wonder and hands eager to learn. Miguel watched him secure the ropes, just as he had taught his own son decades earlier. The motions were a little clumsy, but the spirit was there, curious, determined, rooted in legacy. The boy looked up. "Are we ready, Grandpa?" Miguel smiled. "Let's take her out." As they eased away from the dock, other fishermen waved from their boats, some of which now bore small plaques marking their permitted fishing zones. The water felt calmer than it had in months, not because of the wind or current, but because the fear was gone. There was order now. There was respect. Midway through the bay, Miguel pointed to a rocky outcrop. "There," he said to his grandson, "is where the mackerel gather when the tide shifts. And if you look closely, you'll see the water's color change. That's the current moving." The boy leaned forward, soaking it all in. Later that afternoon, Miguel would join the research team aboard their vessel. He did that twice a week now, working as a local guide. He taught them about fish migrations, underwater ridges, how the moon tugged on their world beneath the surface. He didn't speak in scientific terms, but in stories. And they listened intently. Dr. Vega had offered him a permanent part-time role after the trial ended. She told him that people like him, people with lived knowledge, were irreplaceable. Miguel didn't care much for titles, but he carried a new ID card in his wallet now, one that made his grandson beam with pride every time he saw it. As the Nueva Esperanza glided through the familiar waters, Miguel took a long breath of sea air, rich with salt and promise. He thought back to the rainy roadside, to the stranger with a flat tire, to the quiet decision he made that day to stop, to help, to ask for nothing. "One simple act of kindness returned to me when I needed it most," he murmured aloud, not just to himself, but to the waves, to the sky, to the boat beneath his feet. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it never comes. But today it did. And with that, the Nueva Esperanza sailed forward. Not just a boat, but a story. One of loss, of standing firm, of community, and of quiet, unwavering hope passed from one generation to the next. Miguel had once believed that the moment his boat was destroyed, his story had come to an end. And why wouldn't he? Everything he had built, everything he had relied on for a lifetime, had shattered in an instant beneath the weight of wealth and arrogance. In that moment, soaked in seawater and silence, it felt like the sea had finally taken more than it ever gave. But what he couldn't have known then, what none of us can know when we're standing in the wreckage, is that some endings are really just disguised beginnings. Because when everything was taken from him, something else stepped in. Justice, compassion, memory. The kindness he had once shown to a stranger in the middle of a storm returned to him, amplified through the voices of people who believed in right over power, in fairness over fear. His neighbors who scraped together coins, the researchers who shared their evidence, the legal advocate who fought beside him, and a retired judge who never forgot the heart of a humble fisherman. All of them helped turn the tide. What rose from the wreckage wasn't just a new boat. It was a new chapter, one shaped by dignity, one guided by the wisdom of the sea and the strength of a legacy that couldn't be crushed under steel. Today, Miguel sails not just for himself, but for every soul who's ever stood against something bigger, stronger, louder. For every quiet act of goodness that seemed forgotten until the world proved it wasn't. So if this story touched your heart, even just a little, take a moment now. Give it a like and subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories for more real and powerful tales like this one. And in the comments below, share just one word that describes how this story made you feel. Because sometimes one word is all it takes to keep a story going.